All right. Welcome everyone to the Suomen Permaculture series of Permatalks. I am your host today, Alexi. We are joined with Joshua Finch from Finch Agroecology. He will talk with us about no-dig gardening. His opinion, of course. Please feel free to write your questions in the chat. Just remember, it will be asked at the end. There will be a feedback link later on in the chat, so whoever is interested to let us know how was the lecture, feel free. Any questions is welcome. There is no dumb question. We're all here to learn. And so, without any further wait, I will give the speak to Josh. Welcome, Josh.
All right, super. Thank you. I appreciate this. So I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen so you don't have to look at me. It's not really why you're here, I hope. You'll be disappointed because I'll leave the slideshow up for a while. Let's see. Okay, so let's head over here and see if the full screen works. Are we connected now with the slideshow?
Yep.
Okay, great. So we kind of lied a little bit about what tonight's lecture is going to be. I considered only talking about the no-dig method or my application of it, but that would have been about a 5-slide presentation and full of it depends. And then we would just be batting around questions and answers for a while. So I thought that I would still focus on no-dig, but I would like to situate no-dig gardening within permaculture design as I see it. So we have a lecture and then the question and answer portion. This is a photo from one of my first permaculture gardens back in the United States, all the way back in 2012, where I was implementing some of these principles already then. And that just goes to show, even though the science and practice and what you might say the movement around soil health has moved rapidly in the last 5 years, permaculture design has already had a lot of these ideas embedded within it for, well, since its inception. So tonight's program, I have 4 parts to the presentation. The first is to talk about how I see permaculture design as quickly as I possibly can so that you can get some context as to how I put together knowledge in my brain. So that can be quite useful to know because some people see permaculture quite differently. And, you know, so we can all just understand that this is my opinion. And then we're going to jump into soil health as an overview for the second part. And then the third part is the relationship to soil health to permaculture design. And finally, we'll get into what soil health principles can look like at home. And afterwards, you know, the fifth part, of course, is the question and answer that I'm really looking forward to. So a little bit about myself before we get started. Some of you probably have heard of me before with my project at Lil Club. This is what it looked like a few years ago, winter, spring, summer, and fall. It's a small scale. Mostly it's a market garden right now, but it's been designed out with agroforestry, forest gardens, and a bunch of other kind of patterns and features that you might see in a regenerative farm in our climate. I'm originally from Southwest Florida, so I'm from south of the pyramids. I did not study agriculture at the university. I studied history, and that's in part what got me interested in regenerative agriculture in the first place, because the cultures I was studying, they were already documenting the degradation of their environment over 2,000 years ago. And to see what it looks like now, for example, in the Middle East or in the Mediterranean, it's not at all like what I was reading about. So it's sort of near and dear to my heart with history. And there is a bit of a delay on here. And I skipped ahead on my history degree and did a thesis on community gardening all the way back there in 2009, 2010. So it's been more than a decade around a third of my life that I've been interested in these topics. First, I was interested in organics. Then that quickly led into permaculture, agroecology, and holistic management. So I dabble all over the place. I'm really looking for systems that work and not being tied down to one thing or another. And here in Finland, I've had experience volunteering or interning with Dodo at their Kanttapota farm in Pasila, Helsinki, as well as over a year at Staden Puutarhuri. Well, it was basically autumn when all of the other interns went back to school, and then one full growing season. And so I've, just really kept going even when I didn't have access to my own projects. Then I started Lil Club Permaculture in Espoo the very end of 2016. My daughter was born May 2017, so the first growing season. And over the years, I've refined what it is that I'm interested in, pushed in some directions, withdrawn from others. And this year, I renamed my toiminimi Finch Agroecology to better reflect what it is that I'm after. Lil Club is still what I call a field studio. It's where I get to play around with my ideas in practice so that when I'm talking about these things, I can actually back it up with information, with firsthand experience. And you can believe it or you can choose not to, be skeptical. That's fine, totally fine with me. But people are always welcome to come visit the farm and see what I'm doing on the ground. So how do I see permaculture design? If I back up a little bit from permaculture design, this is part of my permaculture introduction to permaculture course. You may have seen this before. The common view in our society is that the environment is separate from the economy and from society. But something more approaching reality is that the environment encompasses all of our societies, and our economic system is a part of our society. And I find that is mirrored quite well with the permaculture ethics of earth care, people care, and fair share. So this is one of the reasons why, although I may not use the word permaculture as often as I used to, I still feel like it's at the foundation of what I'm doing because it really reflects the world as I see it. And I see permaculture as a voluntary value structure. Earth care, people care, fair share. These are ethical values. And it's voluntary, so we get to choose whether or not we participate in or use permaculture design. And permaculture is intended to bring human systems in line with natural systems. It's completely pro-human, and I like that as well. One thing that differentiates the way I see permaculture from many other people, though, is that I believe permaculture has to be consciously adopted and applied because it is a quite well thought out design framework and a good way to think about the world. And you can't really do something this intricate completely by happenstance. The last thing that I like about permaculture, it allows every individual to choose what they believe to be as care of the earth, care for people, and fair share, or return of surplus, however you would like to interpret the third ethic. And that allows for differentiation between the practitioners, so we're not all clones of each other. I also like to see permaculture more as like a psychological frame of reference. And so as you use permaculture design, it becomes embedded within the way you see systems. Okay, that was just a truck passing. They're building a power plant next to my farm. So I see things a lot differently. This is definitely a much different depiction of permaculture design than you might find generally floating around the internet. I like the fact that it encourages you to have implementation and motor output, and then the reinvestment of the information that you gather and the things that you learn back into the system. And as you learn these patterns, then you become more fluent with permaculture design, and you can make more connections with the same information. So that's kind of how I see permaculture design. It's quite different. Let's just jump into soil health as an overview. We won't get into the details necessarily until the end. So although soil health and sometimes permaculture design are commonly referred to as the way people always used to do things, or as common sense, or what your grandparents did, you can visit pretty much any of the major agricultural production lands in Europe, in North America, and across the developing world now, and you will see absolutely large bare fields, very poor riparian buffers at the bottom of these valleys. There's inevitably some kind of stream, and they're clearly following the European Union minimum size riparian buffers here. You have almost universally like deforested hilltops. So soil health and permaculture design still have a long way to go before they come mainstream. But I think we're reaching a turning point in the last few years. If we think about soil at the most basic and fundamental form, it's a living ecosystem. There's a complex interaction between the geology of your site, the biology that is present, and of course, water. Soil is not the same as dirt. Soil is not the same as compost. It's not the same as mulch. It's not the same as potting soil. It's not the same as a rock wool substrate that you might use in a hydroponic system. Soil must have minerals, sand, silt, clay, and any mixture of those, living organisms, and water pulls all of that together. Here's just a collection of images from domestic projects that I've worked on kind of around the world. On the top, you've got images from North America with what kind of soils that I was working with at the beginning. With heavy clay that you build bricks out of and make buildings. I should have said make bricks and build buildings, but that's fine. I've been experimenting with polyculture since the beginning as well. We might even get into the role of nitrogen fixers at some point in this discussion. And then this is my little, very experimental and probably the most weedy garden in all of Finland at my family's summer cottage on the border of Russia. It's a living ecosystem, soil is. So one thing that's really important to understand is that these ecosystems have been evolving for an extremely long time. This is a circular depiction of the formation of Earth and the evolution of life on Earth. So the first humans, not necessarily Homo sapiens, arrived only around 2 million years ago. Something like this, plus or minus, doesn't really matter when you compare it against billions and hundreds of millions of years. People have been farming for around 15,000 years. We have been gardening, gathering, hunting, and otherwise managing ecosystems to some extent for hundreds of thousands of years. But that still pales in comparison to the length of time that all of these organisms, from the plants, the bacteria, the fungi, even the viruses, I'll include them as organisms for the sake of simplicity, have been co-evolving together to make use of the resources that are available on Earth. And so I believe that when we take this into consideration, the first permaculture principle of observation and interaction is super important, because our ideas as to how these things are supposed to work are not the same as how they actually work. And if you don't think that hundreds of millions of years, for example, with the evolution of flowering plants, is a useful time scale, you can still go back 23 million years before present to the Neogene period, or even 2.5 million years to the Quaternary period. 23 million years ago, if you were put in a time machine and transported back, you would begin to see not necessarily the same species that we have today, but you would see the same patterns of behavior and ecosystem dynamics beginning to evolve. This is when grasses started to appear. This is when we began to see herding animals, herding mammals, along with the predator-prey relationships. So we have at least 20 million years of evolution to look at when we consider how these ecosystems are supposed to function. And that is my great wellspring of inspiration, as well as trust in these systems. Trusting Mother Nature it's not just a fad thing to say. This is millions of years of research and development and making it through many extinction events, many upheavals, and yet life goes on. So I believe that we have to really pay attention and trust that nature knows best. The soil health movement is wide and varied, but typically you can find that there are now 6, I put that in air quotes, they're not air quotes, but I'm making them right now, principles of soil health. The soil health movement has identified these 6 patterns to healthy soil. I've condensed them to 5 for this presentation. The first one should be no stranger to anyone here. If you've been reading about, listening to, investigating permaculture for a while, it's context, context, context. Always consider the context of the system, of the people, of the ecosystem before making anything resembling a judgment regarding what's going on and what's the best course of action. So we're not going to talk about context today because it should be familiar to everyone here. Keeping soil covered, having diverse living roots as long as possible in the ground, minimizing soil disturbance, and integrating animals, however, are 5 wonderful patterns that have been shown to work on every continent where there's production agriculture, from your balcony garden to tens of thousands of hectares and hundreds of thousands of animals on the properties. So these things are widely adaptable. They're patterns that then you resolve at your contextual level, and we'll get into that. On the right is a site preparation workflow that I made 9 years ago before a lot of this science came out. And at the bottom, you start with things that support soil health and things that you can do. And as you work your way up, you get to the top of the star, and that's soil health. In those intervening decades, I have decided that we should put the pause button on jump-starting the system using lime, so not using calc in order to change or balance the soil pH. That's generally not necessary. It's a waste of money in most cases. Double digging the soil definitely violates minimized soil disturbance, so careful consideration before employing that method. And then lastly, even organic fertilizers and rock dust may or may not be appropriate for supporting soil health. And we'll get into that. But the star of the show really is living material. In this diagram, partly for the sake of making it look okay, I have the same size between the living materials and the dead materials. But what's actually important is life. That's that diverse living roots as long as possible. Living organisms drive soil health. Compost, fertilizer, lime, mulch, all of those things are important or can be important, but they are secondary to diverse living roots as long as possible in the soil, period. This is something that is actually paradigm changing. You could find hints of this in the permaculture sort of literature in the last 10, 15, even 20 years. People have been talking about this, but very often we put equal weight on dead stuff that we bring to the system. And that really needs to go to the back of the bus rather than given equal airtime to living material. So let's get into this as a brief explanation. Keep soil covered. I'm not going to read this. Soil on the left is a depiction. You've got soil horizons. You have O, A, B, C, R. Some people use more classifications than others. But at the top of the mineral soil, before you see sand, silt, or clay, whichever kind of soil you have, In a healthy ecosystem, there is an organic layer there. The organic layer is referring to the residue, the litter, the manure of living organisms, what they have deposited on the soil surface, and that keeps it covered. And the soil is alive, right? And a lot of the organisms that are there will be killed by the ultraviolet radiation from the sun. The organic layer, the mulch layer, protects those organisms, moderates the soil temperature, reduces transpiration, evaporation of water from the soil, does many different things, but its primary function is the same as having unbroken skin on your own body. If you're full of cuts and full of holes, it's very likely you're going to get infected, and your body is going to be fighting off, bacteria and viruses and even fungi all the time. We have to keep the soil covered. Next, we want diverse living roots as long as possible. The photo on the right is visiting a family member's summer cottage right around midsummer, and he's basically roller crimping this meadow in order to get to the cottage with his Peugeot there. That is a diverse living system right there. That has got many different plant families. It's not as diverse as we might like upon further inspection, but it's diverse, and you have trees and you have pasture systems at the same time. The reason why you want to have diverse living roots as long as possible is because all plants, especially at the family level, have different kinds of symbiotic relationships with different sets of organisms that live in the soil, that live in their roots, that live on their roots, that live on their stems, leaves, flowers, and seeds. And you need a diversity of organisms in the soil. And the plants support that when they're different because they have these different root exudates, this liquid carbon pathway that you've probably heard that mentioned in a lot of permaculture material before. Plants don't hoard all of the photosynthesis that they produce. Depending on the time of the year and the local context, they can be distributing even more than half of the sugars that they produce through their roots to deliberately feed different kinds of organisms in the soil. And that changes the game completely in terms of what is happening underground with regards to unlocking minerals from the soil and delivering them to plants. Not only do you have all of this crazy amount of life happening below ground, but you also have diverse airborne signaling. Plants are not communicating only underground, they communicate above ground as well. When you brush by a mint plant and you smell that lovely mint smell, that is not for our pleasure or edification. Now, of course, it's probably been selected for that over time, but those smells are the plant's way of communicating. And when you have many kinds of plants and many communications going through the air at the same time, what we call pests, organisms that cause problems, many of the insects home in on their preferred food sources by sampling the chemicals in the air through smell. And when you have many different kinds of chemicals, the theory at least is that it may be able to confuse some of the more generalists. Now, if it turns out that they're like frogs and they only can smell their food source, then, okay, that theory is going to go out the door, but it's still a solid theory. Different plants have different site condition tolerances. Probably don't have to tell permaculture people that. They have different forms above ground, different kinds of architecture, different habits in terms of how fast they grow, how quickly they leaf out, when do they flower, what do they look like. All of these things matter. They change the physical space in which we live and in which all these other organisms live. Not only that, when you have many different kinds of plants together, you get many different kinds of yields. It doesn't have to just be something you're going to take home and eat, but it can also be something like unlocking more phosphorus from the soil and sharing it with some plants next door. So diversity is paramount. Next, you want those living roots as long as possible so you can keep feeding soil life, using the water that you're blessed with, binding any mobile nutrients in the biomass of the underground economy or even in the biomass of those plants over the longest time span. Some of the only things we get in life for free, still sunlight, precipitation. And those are the two things that life on Earth needs in order to drive everything else. So what we want to see is that as soon as the sun comes out, which is kind of rare sometimes here, that we see green coming up. And that's one of the reasons why these spring ephemeral plants are so important. They leaf out, they flower, they perform ecosystem services before the canopy above it leaves out and puts them in the dark. They can scavenge a lot of nutrients, and when they die back and they start to decompose, some of those nutrients that were bound up in their roots and in their stems and in their flowers and everything can go back to the canopy above. So we have diverse species, we have diverse niches in time that can respond to changing conditions on the ground. Very important. Minimizing disturbance does not just mean going no-till, or as the subject of this talk was supposed to be, no dig. No, this would be basically the only slide if this is the thing that I was talking about. So this is why I'm not just talking about it. Disturbance in most of our gardens, talking to permies is probably going to refer to disturbing the soil mechanically or by using animals, because most permaculture people probably are not going to be dumping a lot of chemicals onto the soil, although minimizing disturbance also would refer to overutilization of uncomposted animal manures, overuse of composted animal manures, or anything else that is labeled organic that a permaculture gardener might decide to use in their system. The thing about it is that we want to minimize disturbance, though, because not all disturbance is bad. It just depends, as many things, on the context. How often does it happen? How long does it occur for? Is it repair, or do we go about repairing the damage immediately? So we need to know what the consequences are to this tillage or digging, as you might refer to in a vegetable garden. It rips fungal networks to pieces, not just our wondrous mycorrhizal fungi, but also the decomposer fungi and all these other kinds of fungi that live in the soil and have a role in maintaining the health of the ecosystem. Like almost any organism, if you rip it to pieces enough, it's going to be open to attack by other fungi, by bacteria, diseases. They won't be in the mode of finding resources and giving them to your plants. They're going to be in the mode of, oh my gosh, I just got ripped to pieces. Now I have to reconstitute my entire body. So let's try to think of the fungi and not rip them open constantly. It destroys soil organism habitat. There was a study that ended at 30 years in Canada about how long does a single earthworm burrow last. The researcher died after 30 years. They could last more than 30 years, could be less, but 30 years is quite a long time. It's almost as old as I am, a single earthworm burrow. So imagine the kind of soil you can have if you minimize soil disturbance for 30 years in the same garden. Those organisms don't have to rebuild as if it was a bombing raid during the Second World War every spring and autumn. You're destroying a complex environment. If you want to think of it as a city, some people like to think of it as a city with an economy and roads and railways and these kind of things because it's what we're used to seeing. I don't really like that analogy too much, but you can imagine, a city being hit by an earthquake, a landslide, a hurricane comes, and then a tsunami. Like, you're asking a lot from your soil to put up with that kind of disturbance. So we need to really minimize that to the utmost. It also changes the soil chemistry and biology in a generally negative fashion. Adding too much oxygen into the soil wakes up certain dormant bacteria that are waiting for that high oxygen environment. And when they wake up, they're hungry. And what do they want to eat? They want to eat things like we do. They want to eat carbon-based foods. What is carbon-based foods? Well, if you just tilled in compost, well, the compost could be their food. And they will burn through organic matter in your soil. So you may see a release of nutrients when you till, or as reflected in a flush of growth in your plants, but over the long haul, you're not building the soil ecosystem in a positive way. You're basically allowing the weeds of the bacteria world to take over and try to repair things. And they're not going to repair things in the same way you're hoping that they're going to. However, if you're going to disturb the soil, stack functions. So here's a photograph of double digging about a decade ago in the United States, where I would double dig these beds where I was going to make a forest garden. I amended it with lime, which I might have done in the same situation because the pH was like 4.4 or something, is quite low. I added a slow release organic fertilizer. I covered the soil with big mounds of leaves that I was composting. And then when I would make the next set of beds, I would flip those leaves onto those beds. So when it rained, it would leach out any humic substances down into the soil that I just had loosened up. And then I would cover and plant immediately into these beds with compost and wood chips. So I was doing many things at once with the intention of minimizing soil disturbance going forward. So it's not that you should never dig. It's that digging needs to be thought through, and it doesn't need to become a recreational hobby that you do every spring or every autumn. Really need to think about why you're digging and what you're trying to accomplish before doing so. Lastly, integrate animals. And this is kind of a joke slide because clearly we don't have woolly mammoths and we don't have woolly rhinoceroses. We don't have any of these creatures, but it's still important to note that all ecosystems have animals. Every ecosystem has animals. They evolved with animals, and they've evolved with them for so long that we need animals in the system for them to be balanced. There's a relationship between herbivory and ecosystem health that's only beginning to be understood, and it's mostly a function of time. How long are the animals present on the thing? But we're not going to spend much time talking about integrating animals. But I thought I would throw that one in there because if it fits your context and you're okay with it, bringing animals into the system really will push your system to the next level. Now, how does no-dig and soil health relate to permaculture design? Well, if we start at the bottom of any system that we're working on, you've got your own personal code of ethics, and that's going to be your guiding light to whatever it is you're doing in life. If we're talking about a physical site with a garden, which is the topic of this discussion, then you're going to apply permaculture design as you use it with your own personal disposition. Next up, you go to design patterns. What kind of patterns do we want? Well, we want to mimic nature. Let's look at agroecology, agroforestry for the basic patterns for our site. How are we going to maintain those patterns on our site? We need some management patterns as well. Designing it and implementing it is all well and good, but if it's not managed afterwards, it's not going to be as good as it could be because human beings can manage ecosystems quite well. We've been doing it for a long time. Soil health principles, I think, fall into management patterns. After that, you get down to the nitty-gritty details. You have this context-aware implementation of the management patterns, of the design patterns, of your permaculture design, and your personal ethics. So soil health is not permaculture. Permaculture is a design system combined with ethics. You can put the soil health principles and the no-dig method into your toolkit if you choose, or not, but it's not permaculture. Permaculture is a bigger thing than soil health principles or even agroforestry or agroecology. They're not all the same, but they all fit together to get you to the pointy end of the stick. Now, this is taken from my earlier slide about building a permaculture frame of reference. I'm not going to read all of this. We're going to look at the permaculture design principles as it relates to no-dig. So when I like to think of the design principles and group them together, the first step is to turn data into information. Well, observe and interact is the most important. I've already talked about that. We need to look and mimic nature and observe what evolutionary time is trying to tell us about how these systems work. Pattern to details. Well, Soil health principles are nothing but patterns. They are not details. How you cover the soil, which species you use, which animals, all of those details are for you to decide in your own context, but it gives you patterns that work. When in doubt, return to the pattern that brought you there in the first place. And of course, they obtain yields. I have produced way too many vegetables at Little Club using these ideas. They work. Next, how does nature obtain a yield? What are the kind of the highest design directives for your garden? Well, we want to catch and store energy. That's reflected in the soil health principle of diverse living roots as long as possible. You're catching and storing that solar, water, carbon, mineral, and even the social energy when you have lots of different plants growing, because people like polycultures, believe it or not. They like them more than they like monocultures. Integrate diverse living roots as long as possible. Diversity coming together. It's right there. It reflects with permaculture design. Small and slow solutions. We operate on nature's time frame and use as minimal outside inputs as possible. The power of diverse seeds sprouting together, growing together, communicating together, sharing, and perhaps even in competing together is going to produce results for you. It may not be as fast and whiz-bang as spraying on some nitrogen fertilizer onto your plants, but small and slow solutions add up over time. These soil health principles were basically made by somebody who had studied permaculture, wouldn't you think? How do you unlock those or achieve those design directives? Well, we want to use renewable resources. What's more renewable than seeds, sun, and water? We want to value the marginal. Well, all land is valuable. Even soil that isn't producing much for you anymore can be brought back quickly, very rapidly. This is something permaculture designers have been pushing for decades, but has only just begun to be appreciated in the last 10 years or so by mainstream agriculture. Lastly, we've got diversity. Well, diverse living roots as long as possible. I don't want to beat that dead horse too much, but diversity, diversity, diversity. The only note that I will make here, though, is that we want functional diversity. That's something I'll talk in more detail about at the end of the presentation, what functional diversity in a no-dig system looks like. And then the very last set of principles, how do we reflect, calibrate, and green light our ideas? Well, produce no waste. Well, do you think a cover crop produces waste? If you do, then you don't understand what a cover crop is doing, and you're probably not listening to this presentation. And after, I don't know how long it's been, but I'm listening to my own voice talking about this. It's getting kind of funny. I'm getting closer to the end, I promise. Respond creatively. Well, everything's contextual, and we want diverse living roots as long as possible. And those diverse plants can respond creatively with their own natural intelligence. And our imagination allows us to facilitate the natural intelligence of the systems that we're working with. And definitely the last one, self-regulate, accept feedback. Nature's going to tell you what's going on. And you've got to reincorporate that back into your worldview. So we don't want to bang our heads doing the same thing over and over and over again. Now, what does soil health look like at home? Here is I think this was February in North Carolina with a cover crop after my first season of growing vegetables in polycultures there. Capturing that sunlight with diverse living roots, producing pollen for organisms. You know, we've got everything going on here. And this is it was a very small garden. Before we get into the details, though, as much as I can in a presentation like this, I really want to hammer home the fact that soil health is only one part of a holistic approach to landscape management. This is the site analyses for a design that I did a few years ago, and that's just the beginning. If you're here listening to this with the Permaculture Association, then I shouldn't have to tell you that, but it's good to poke your head up from the no-dig every once in a while and, you know, consider the whole before implementing anything. What does keeping the soil covered look like at home? Well, the top left picture is not at home, but that's where it kind of feels like is at Lil Club. We've got living plants, diverse living plants. All of these rows had produced garlic plus at least one other species of vegetable. And as soon as they were harvested in July, we immediately put in diverse living covers. Immediately. And then this is sometime, I think, in early September, late August, something like this. Instead of leaving it as just, or getting another vegetable in there, I'm getting those diverse living roots to build my soil for me in order to provide habitat, in order to provide some beauty, to do something for me. You can also cover the soil with some kind of mulch or compost. Leaf mulch, wood chips, all very good. Regular compost, also very good. Vermicompost, super. Straw, well, it kind of depends on the context, but straw, maybe if someone has a question about straw, we can get into it, but I don't want to spend too much time. But clearly, if you keep it moist and you're not disturbing the soil, fungi are going to come up and they're going to start eating that straw, and they're going to start releasing some of the nutrients that are bound up in there to the soil. But we need to remember that it's the living plants that provide around 2/3 of all soil carbon. And it's the living plants that keep the soil aggregated, that feed the fungi in the soil and the bacteria, that ultimately feed all of those macroorganisms all the way up to birds and lizards and snakes and people and everything else. It's the plants that are doing it. All of this stuff at the bottom is a way of human beings taking our garbage and trying to help nature. It's useful, but it's not as important as living plants. So don't feel bad if you can't get your hands on any of these other inputs. Get yourself and invest in some seeds. Those diverse living roots as long as possible, polycultures, cover crop mixes, perennials, very, very important. We want at least 4 plant families growing together such that their roots intermingle. They need to grow close enough together so their roots actually touch each other. That's not something you see in a typical market garden, although these 2 pictures are from my first season at Lil Club when I was way over ambitious with my polycultures and I grew more dandelions and vegetables at some point, I think, except for kale. But you can see I've been playing with these ideas for a long time. This is Lil Club at the top. The bottom left is a budding forest garden in North Carolina where we have the cabbage family, we have the legume family, we have the mint family, we've got the onion family, we have the plantain family, we've got grasses. The list just goes on, and they're all intermingling their roots together, sharing resources, partitioning the soil profile, and providing yields. Later on, high summer kind of looked something like this. Even planting roses in there and having some comfrey on a swale. You want cover crops, you want polycultures, and you want perennials. Perennial systems. You probably think that they're obviously no dig, but when you start to scale up, you'll see a lot of farmers tilling their soil between the perennials. But perennials are what most ecosystems are made out of. So let's not forget those. This is, after all, a permaculture association. So let's not forget our perennials. I think I'm going to skip on showing what this looks like from the air because I don't want to crash the system. If we want to look at that later, we can, but it's not necessary. Minimizing disturbance. This is that no dig, no till, or if you're going to dig, you got to do it with intention. This is kind of what Lil Club looked like when I started in 2017. We rolled out cardboard. We dumped tons of compost. We raked it out. And before I had the gritter, we used a tape measure in order to lay out the plants for proper spacing. I can't really emphasize enough how proper spacing is so important when you're doing a vegetable garden, especially at the beginning when you're just getting started and learning the ropes, or having even if you're experienced, a new garden that may or may not have a lot of weeds. This is an escarole. This is a type of chicory going in here. And what we found is the most common spacings are 20 centimeters, 30 centimeters, or some combination of those. Use 20 or 30 centimeters apart, and you're going to grow just about anything. And if you need more space, double or triple it for 60, 90. And keeping it regular allows you to minimize thought process as you weed systems, even if they're small scale. Here we are raking away the residue from a cover crop in the the late summer in order to get in and weed, using occultation. So I don't poke holes in my plastic. I like to keep my plastic as whole as possible, and use it for a long period of time to cut out the sunlight, to keep the plants from photosynthesizing, so that I weaken them, so that later when I sheet mulch and add compost, then I'm 1 or 2 steps ahead of the weeds. Doing this means you're going to use a lot of wheelbarrows. So, don't forget to have a wheelbarrow that you like and be able to fix it. You can also turn beds over, even in a market garden situation that you're not necessarily needing fancy equipment for. This was a baby lettuce row. I had planted way too much baby lettuce. I scythed it down, raked it more or less even as a mulch, and then we covered it with a thin layer of compost and planted directly in there about a week or 2 afterwards. The lettuce was almost completely gone. The water that was in the lettuce, those nutrients that were bound up, they burst, the cell walls burst during decomposition, and then they were feeding soil organisms, which in turn had nutrients available for the following crop. So this idea that you also need to be tilling in crop residues and things like this, its appropriate place is on the soil surface. And that also goes for compost. Tilling in compost into the soil, maybe, but generally no. We want to feed from above. Remember that most of your soil carbon is going to come from these diverse living roots, 4+ plant families together, working synergistically in order to pump carbon down into the soil. It's not going to come from this. This is going to oxidize and disappear at some point. Lastly, it's not a soil health principle, but please think about access. Access is one of those mainframe permaculture design ideas that Jeff Lawton is always harping on about, but it's very important to consider how you're going to get around or prevent things from getting around your garden. I don't want to go into too much detail about this during this talk, but think about it. Okay, like you can change it later using no-dig principles, and and if you had wood chips on your pathways and compost in your growing beds, you can swap things around and change your system however you want. But be aware that things need to be moved around the garden. Air needs to move around the garden, and if you ever have visitors, it's kind of nice if they know where to go. I believe we're at this is, I think, the last slide. And I have heard nothing this whole time except my own voice, so this is kind of creepy. The last part is integrate animals on a small scale, domestic level. Birds are probably one of the easiest things to integrate. Chickens, pheasants, quail, turkeys, ducks, geese. I'm probably forgetting something there. I'm sure someone's got some other crazy peacocks, right? Birds are generally more appropriate on a small scale. But don't forget wildlife, because they're there and they don't understand. It's not that they don't understand. Why would they understand that it's your garden? So again, I'm talking to a permaculture audience here, so I'm not going to think that I need to drive this point home too much, but that garden of yours does not exist in the mind of any wildlife out there. It's just another part of this earth that they live on. So let's consciously think about how to integrate them into our system so they act beneficially. There's a lot more to do to get there, but it's always fun if you leave, for example, a sunflower stem in your garden. That sunflower stem over the winter can provide a hibernation area for beneficial insects. And if you're lazy like me and you don't knock it down, it becomes a perch for birds to scout and look for insects and bugs and worms or whatever it is else they want to come, probably eat your peas or maize or whatever as well. They definitely like to eat vegetable seeds. But small things like this, be observant and watch and see how wildlife interacts. Things don't always have to be totally clean, especially at home, especially on a home scale. There's basically no reason why things need to look totally immaculate. Like, I don't even know anymore because I don't look at those kind of gardens too much. Lastly, remember that you are also an animal. Compost your waste products and use them judiciously in your gardens. And if you do that along with the other soil health principles, you'll find that perhaps you and your family and your friends, your community, are all that that land might actually need in terms of a big animal pumping its inputs into the system. So, yep, I pressed the right-hand key and nothing happened. So that means I'm finished. And I really hope that this didn't disconnect and I've been talking to myself for an hour. So I'm going to stop sharing and figure out what's going on.
Oh no, you did great, Josh. You've been I think everything has been heard. Thank you. So now we're at the questioning part.
Yeah.
There is actually one question already written by Tarna. She's asking about spacing. How does wide spacing go together with keeping the ground covered? Why such a wide gaps between plants? What about growing plants close together and harvest while they are growing? And she says also that she usually do this with kale, lettuce, onions. And she says it was a really interesting speech, by the way.
No, well, I appreciate that feedback, and that's a good question. That photo is from when we had more weeds than you can imagine, and at least that photograph was from a market garden that was intending to produce 30,000 plus euros in revenue. And so if you're farming for sale and you're farming for a living, that really changes the game, because the beauty standards for vegetables are exceptionally high. The uniformity that's expected and the uniformity of bringing it to the market, and there's many other factors. As I've gotten rid of a lot of the weeds, I'm bringing in the spacing a lot and doing what you were talking about and you've had some success with, which is interplanting. And interplanting is really what I want to, yes, support 100%. Things don't grow at the same speed. And so you will have a lot of space. Like maybe if your final spacing between kale plants that you desire is 50 centimeters, so you have a lot of airflow at the end of the autumn, you don't need the sun shining on anything other than green leaves between those kale plants during the season. So pop in something that grows faster or that can stand a little bit of shade and make use of that sunlight. But there is a really great phrase, and it goes like this: brown is bad, gold is good, green is best. And what that means is that brown is kind of the color that a lot of people consider dirt to look like, or soil's brown. So if you can see soil, that's bad, because the sun is irritating that soil, and I talked about it a little bit there. It's drying everything out, it's capping it. You're not supporting life at that point. You're losing life. Gold refers to the color that, for instance, something like straw or hay takes on when it's dry, when it's ready to use as the mulch. It's gold. And so mulches on top, that restoring the organic layer of your soil, even if it's compost and not what you might consider as a normal mulch, that's good, because at least the sun and the rain and everything is not destroying your soil surface, where the most activity is happening in those first few centimeters. So you want to protect that like all get out. But the best thing are those diverse living plants, just as you said. I like, 20 centimeters between plants sounds like a lot if you think about radishes or carrots. So I don't do that with radishes or carrots. It's more like 5 centimeters, 3 to 5 centimeters. Or picking things out and thinning as you go. All of those are wonderful techniques to keep those living roots as long as possible.
Yeah, I totally agree, and it's super beneficial. There is a question from Lumia that asks, "What's the deal with straw?" Or what is your deal?
Well, the thing about straw is it's not diverse. Usually it's not exceptionally diverse. Straw, anyway. So my understanding is that straw and hay are two different things. So hay would be more something that's cut from a diverse, hopefully a diverse pasture that hasn't been sprayed with anything. And so then you have many different kinds of things, not just grasses, but you have grasses and forbs together. And what's been locked into that organic matter is diverse, and it decomposes at different rates. So hay, if it doesn't have a lot of seeds, is probably better. Straw, from my understanding, is often it's well, it's the last straw. It's what the farmer removes from the field and leaves no residue. And so generally it's from like a monoculture, so you have one thing. But it's still it's fine. But I've also found that in our climate where I am, that kind of mulch acts as a very, very good habitat for slugs and snails. And so depending on what you're growing and what your context is, I can tell you as a market farmer, you don't want slugs and snails because people won't buy it. They'll send it back. They'll send back the food. They won't buy it. They'll tell all their friends that you have slugs and snails all up in your cabbages. Again, they may not be. You can wash it out and you can clean it, but it's not the thing. So straw, depends on your context and what you're doing, but yeah, keep it away from your lettuce. Maybe would be good.
Yeah, I did hear the same thing, but although if you want to use straw, then you should definitely have some ducks walking around to get rid of those slugs and those snails because they do the job really well.
Yeah, in a home scale, remember, yeah.
Yeah,
remember, everything that I'm trying to talk about is mostly home scale, though. I really hope that I make that clear because, yeah, you can do that. You can do that. But if you're selling food, you can't have ducks running around your lettuces.
Yeah.
You should be able to, but you can't.
Maybe it will change. Maybe it will change soon. Who knows? Erki has a question. Well, digging is mostly about weeds and preparing the beds, and he's asking if you plant everything yourself.
Do I plant everything myself? Well, the first year I planted most things by myself because I didn't have any interns. I had just started and everything was, well, there was no farm. So it's kind of hard to convince anyone to come and intern if there's no farm. But then since 2018, I've had interns. I've trained over 20 interns. They work for free. They come green. They learn quickly. Most of them
bring friends.
And they do really well. They become friends. Yeah. But no, I don't plant everything by myself. This year I'm planting quite a lot by myself though, because I only have one intern and then I have some volunteers because I've changed things. But in the past, before I really understood that I did not want to do 2 to 3 successions, multiple plantings per season for sale, and constantly import compost and basically be a carbon copy of Fortier or Perkins or anybody else who's just import nutrients. That's not why I got into this. So I scaled things back. But then we would be planting up to 200 times a year. That's like maybe with a paper pot transplanter, but I'm also not totally sold on that yet either, because that's importing from Japan or whoever makes those chains. But no, yeah, I plant mostly by myself. And yeah, the digging, we've done a lot of pulling of weeds. I mean, you'd call this farm no dig pretty loosely in the first few years because I have a 0 tolerance policy for perennial rhizomatous weeds in a garden in that kind of sense. I hope that answers the question.
It does cause a lot of trouble over the whole season if you leave anything.
Yeah. Von Puki's edible, but good luck selling 5,000 square meters of it.
There's a really good question, and I think that's a question that maybe you've been asking yourself as well over the years. Like, how do you integrate deer?
I cry a lot. I don't own the property here, and it's I really carved it out of. I mean, you'd have had to have been here almost before anything started to see what it looked like. So I've never had the resources to put in a game fence, but 2.5 meter high fence around the property. And then it's not mine. So I'd have to get not only, planning permission, but probably the neighbors. So as much as I would like to fence, I think if you can fence your zone 1 for sure, or maybe even your zone 2. I'm not a fan of perimeter fencing. I can say that because I don't have a big farm, but I'm not a fan of that because I think if everyone does that, then where do the animals go? And that doesn't fit well with my understanding, and my interpretation of care for the earth would be nothing's allowed here. So what I have done is taken a hybrid approach. During the early spring, we cover the rows with metal hoops that we cut from 4 millimeter hot zinced wire. And then over those hoops, we stretch row cover, which I don't like it very much, but it keeps the plants a little warm, and it keeps the flea beetles off. And it also keeps the birds, we have so many birds here, from eating all my seeds while they germinate. But that doesn't really keep deer out. Once they realize that what's under there is good, they just break through. So there have been times when I've come to the farm and I've had 100 heads of romaine lettuce, almost a kilo a piece, like ready to harvest. And every 30 centimeters is a rip in the fabric, and the heart of the romaine ripped out and eaten in one night. Like, you lose 500 euros in a night and you're scraping by. It's rough. So last year, what I did was I took a page out of Charles Dowding's book to protect against rabbits. And I bought bird netting, which again, not a very big fan of because it's this disgusting plastic fabric. But I stretched that over the row covers. And the texture of it seems to throw the rabbits and the deer off. I did have some issues last year where they did eventually try to get in, but now we build basically a fortress of hoops. It's funny, but it works for the most part. So if you can do that, and then in the summer when it gets too hot and you don't need the row covers anymore, take the row covers off and then use the hoops and put on the bird netting. But be prepared that, especially in the spring, you're going to be fishing out birds. Because they want to eat worms and stuff, and they get stuck. Later in the year, if some sales can pick up, I am going to prototype a different way of using pergolas, these vertical garden structures that you use generally to train vines or something up, and they're like garden features, and building those around certain plots, and then taking the bird netting that's now horizontal across the plots, turning it vertical, and using it like a shower curtain, because I'm not allowed to have a permanent fence, but if it's only there for a season and then you can move it when you want to get in and then at night close it, we'll see how it goes. I mean, it could totally fail, but it's worth trying because I like to see my plants. Believe it or not, I do like to look at my plants and not just, check under the, skirt. So deer are a problem.
If I can add also for the deer, one could always design a space for them with available plants to eat that is a bit more further away. Who knows? Maybe that could be done. So some kind of mini pathway with plants to eat around to direct them away from your garden. Who knows?
I think that's a good idea, especially at home in like a homestead kind of scale. You're going to because you're not growing the food for a living, generally speaking. So you do have more free time, and you can manage your zone 2, your zone 3, your zone 4. And if you have a zone 5, I guess you don't manage that at all, but that'd be pretty sizable. But once you get into managing zone 4 and zone 3, which should, in my opinion, be larger than your zone 1 and your zone 2, and you're taking care of it and adding diversity in there, they probably don't want to come to your zone 1. And it would be different, I think, if I lived here, because I have dogs, and they would keep the deer partially away from our house, where your garden would be.
The smell, the noise. Yeah. I do have another addition to that. what do you think about maybe doing small scale hugel beds that you could use, like I said, like as a way to divert the attention of the deer, and just throwing in there your cover crop seeds? Would that make, do they eat those actually, the deer? Have you
They
noticed on
eat
the,
everything.
so that would be maybe a solution
Yeah.
as well. That's an easy solution in a way, right? Because I mean,
Yeah, depending on the context. I mean, I personally would need way too many hugel beds. But I think it's the surface area again. I think it just, if you can get your zone 3 pumping, because one of the things here is that I do have zones, but I can't go out and like manage all of it and take away the thatch because I don't have it. If you could integrate animals into your whole system and you had grazing animals that would be, increasing the biodiversity in your agroforestry silvopastures, then, the deer are going to be there and they're going to love it. And they do love cover crops. Just so keep your zone 1. I think it's wasn't directly asked, but you can grow a lot of food in a really small space with these methods. So depending on how you want to push it, like if you're okay with importing compost, or if you can make enough and if you can work the system. I mean, a family of 4 doesn't really need, even in Finland, much more than about 250 square meters of production. Okay, you're not producing cereals and oils and stuff, but I mean, you'll get your potatoes, you'll get your turnips, you'll get your pumpkins, you'll get all your fresh greens and herbs. That should be, in our socioeconomic context, for a lot of people, it should be possible to fence that off from deer and, then go wild with your perennials, elsewhere.
yeah, yeah. There is another question coming from Erki. He wrote mulching with compost.
Yeah, it's not my
Are
favorite.
Are we talking about finished compost, already started slowly degraded, or fresh? In your opinion, is there like if you would just cut your cover crops and just leave it?
It would depend what I'm planting afterwards. And if it was, if it's commercial, then I'd have a hard time planting into unfinished compost because I need to be able to weed it well and not get my tools all smothered in bits of things that aren't composted yet. But I think that if it's used judiciously, a couple centimeters deep, a fresh a compost that's not finished yet is not really that big of a problem. It's a great mulch. I mean, if you're not digging it in and you're not mixing, as long as you're not mixing that into the soil, if it's just laid on the soil surface, it's really good. I like to use fresh wood chips even as a mulch. Like I've got a lot of my garlic covered in fresh wood chips that have been, I mean, it's not a material most people have, but I get it from an arborist, and it's mixed in with leaves, and the leaves have decomposed over the winter, and the worms have just turned it into worm castings mixed with the wood chips. And every time it rains or if I irrigate, come the growth hormones and some nitrogen and whatever else wants to percolate down. So I wouldn't be I don't think we need to finish our compost as much as normal if it's out in the garden, but if it's in the nursery, for sure, it needs to be done.
Yeah, good. We don't seem to have any more questions. Does anyone wants to write one right now, or well, we have a question from Nick. Do you use a broad fork?
We used one for one season, and it was really good at loosening the root mats of the rhizomatous weeds. I also don't have heavy clay. I situated the market garden in a place that's really well drained, so even in my heavier loam type soils that I have in a couple plots, it's not necessary. Observation is so key in terms of what your soil is like, and if you've got compaction layers, if there's a water infiltrating, these kind of things. I think a broad fork is a tool that has a very narrow like range of use, in my opinion. I think it's really great for site establishment for the first few years, 1 to 3 years, 3 years at most. If you're still broad forking after 3 years, the same space, the same garden beds, then you probably don't have diverse living roots as long as possible, or there's some other issue. But if you have to mechanically aerate the soil that deep on a seasonal basis after 3 years, I would be beginning to wonder what else is happening. But it's very good. It's much better than a regular garden fork if you want to loosen your soil. That's for sure. It's super effective. Probably also really good for harvesting carrots, things like this.
Yeah. We have the last question now. Erki wants to clarify his earlier question about planting. I mean, planting instead of seeding, or is it the other way around, seeding instead of planting? So in either case, you have answered that you don't plant everything yourself, but just to make sure I understood, like, do you seed everything yourself, or do you buy pre-grown plants?
No, I don't buy any, or I mean, I buy sometimes I buy some flowers from like lilies or something to put in the ground with my daughter, but all the vegetables at the farm, I either direct sow them from seeds that I've bought, or I pre-grow them in a nursery myself and then put them in. Yeah, I don't buy transplants, which is it could be a very good option if that's what you need to do, because yeah, it's so different because I don't live here, so I work 7 days a week to keep the temperatures and everything watered and everything. And you know, if things were different and I had a different aim, I might think about buying from a good nursery producer of vegetables, because let them handle that, and then I'll just plant. But I'd like to have control over what I'm doing, and I have to plant when it's real market garden. Then every 2 weeks you're starting it's like lettuce, like every 2 weeks for like 10 weeks, you know. And the idea of buying transplants every 2 weeks of 30 different kinds of vegetables or whatever never really made sense to me. So I just took that in hand myself and I've done it myself, and it's been a learning experience for sure.
Oh yeah, from beginning to end. Would you like to? Do you have anything you'd like to advertise? Do you have any courses coming up, or?
Yeah, well, we've got. I don't know if it's sold out quite yet, but this Sunday in Annala in Helsinki, 2-hour no-dig, hands-on no-dig workshops with Slow Food Helsinki, and everything is being handled by them. So you can find those links on Facebook as well as on my website. If you go to the educational calendar, I updated that the other day when I was at home quarantined with my daughter. Then we also have a 3-part series at the Edible Park in Mustikama that is also being hosted by Slow Food Helsinki. We got the green light from Helsinki City to do these. And the first one will be, well, if I had a calendar, let me tell you the dates. Let's see. Where is May? So we're at the 11th. So 16th is in Annala. And then the Sunday, the 23rd, will be in Mustikama. And that's going to be site analysis, a brief site, how to read the landscape quickly, mainframe permaculture design, water access, soil, along with some of the holistic management, community dynamics, water cycling. We're going to be reading the landscape quickly to show people that if you study permaculture design, you can, and you've gained some proficiency, you can go to a place that I've been there before, but it's been like 6 years. You can read the landscape and make some assessments as to what you should do for the season pretty quickly. Then on the 29th, which is a Saturday, not a Sunday, we'll have a follow-up, which is going to be like planting, no dig gardening, planting, some late spring care of perennials, these kind of things, how you might fix access. All of these are integrated together. And then the final one is on, I believe it's either the 6th or the 7th. It should be, where did it go? 6th, yes. I went to the wrong month. It's going to be the 6th of June, which is a Sunday again. And that wraps it up. So checking in, how did the things we planted before, how are they faring? What should we bring in more of? So tying everything all together in a 3-part series, and those are like 4-hour workshops. So altogether, it'll be 12 hours. And that's with Slow Food Helsinki. Then there could be more stuff coming up, but with coronavirus,
difficult, complex.
Yeah. It's hard to bother. You don't know if you're allowed and anybody shows up.
Yeah. All right, Josh. That's it for today. Thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us, share with us your experience and how you see how soil health is. For our members or whoever is watching, please remember to leave us a feedback. It will be published in the chat. Also, if you are interested yourself to hold a lecture, you can write a form that would also be linked in the chat. Anything is acceptable. Anything is welcome as long as you are willing to put your heart into it. Our next lecture will be with Dominic Jijs on the 20th of May. He will be talking about permaculture design by example. This is going to be a lecture in English. So just to remind. And just want to say thank you to everybody for attending tonight. I hope you enjoyed. We'll see you next time.
No, well, thank you very much. Have a nice evening, everyone.
Yeah, you too.